In the last video, I showed you exactly why the short-term rental model is broken. Today is the solution. There's only 3 real models that can replace that income, and most investors have never even heard of 2 of them. I've tested all 3 personally with my own properties. Here are the real numbers. After I decided to exit Airbnb, I didn't just guess my next move. I spent about 6 weeks running real numbers on every alternative I could find. I talked to operators actually doing these things at scale. I almost made a very expensive mistake. With one of the 3 options, before I caught the problem in the math, the model I eventually chose now generates more monthly income than all 3 of my Airbnbs combined, with a fraction of the management work. I'm going to show you exactly how I got there. I'm going to walk you through all 3 models today: standard long-term rentals, mid-term corporate housing, and commercial triple net leases. For each one, I'll give you the startup cost, the monthly management load, and the real income numbers. By the end, you'll understand exactly why I chose the one I did. Model 1. Model 1 is standard long-term rentals, 12-month leases, traditional tenants. This is where most Airbnb investors land when they first pivot, and honestly, the appeal makes complete sense. No more 2 a.m. messages. No more cleaning turnovers 3 times a week. No more algorithm changes wiping out your rankings. City regulators aren't going to ban standard residential leases. That's protected housing, and local governments know it. So the regulatory risk that's crushing the short-term rental market simply doesn't apply here. If you're converting an existing Airbnb, the startup cost is minimal. You remove the staging furniture, list the unit at market rent, and sign a 12-month lease. No new capital required. The management work drops dramatically. You might interact with the property 3 or 4 times a year instead of 3 or 4 times a week. You're collecting a predictable deposit into your account every month without thinking about it. Now here's the honest trade-off. That most people don't want to hear. Here's what happens to the income. Here's the income reality. The same unit that generated $3,800 gross on Airbnb will rent long-term for roughly $1,900 to $2,100 in most markets. That looks like a 50% revenue cut. But look at the net numbers after you strip out platform fees, emergency cleaning, and constant maintenance. The long-term rental actually nets more per month, with 2 hours of work instead of 22. The income drop is real. The net picture is more nuanced than most people expect. So Model A is a legitimate, low-stress option, especially if your priority is getting out of the hospitality grind completely. The management load is basically nothing. The income is predictable and automatic. The risk of regulation wiping you out overnight is gone. I actually converted one of my 3 units to this exact model first, just to see it in practice before committing further. It worked exactly as expected: quiet, predictable, and completely hands-off. But it also confirmed the growth ceiling immediately. The honest limitation is growth. If you want to preserve something close to your Airbnb income level without adding 10 more doors, Model A alone won't get you there. That's where Model B comes in, and this is the one most short-term rental investors have never considered. Model 2 is mid-term corporate housing. Furnished units rented for 30 days to 6 months at a time. The customer here is completely different from Airbnb. You're not renting to vacationers or weekend travelers. Your tenants are travel nurses on 13-week hospital contracts, corporate executives on temporary relocation, or families displaced by a house fire whose insurance company is footing the bill. These clients have 2 things in common that matter enormously. They need professional, move-in-ready accommodations, and they aren't paying out of their own pocket. Travel nurses get a housing stipend. Executives get a relocation allowance. Insurance clients are fully covered. Because of that, they pay a premium over standard market rent without negotiating. You might be wondering, exactly how much more does this model generate compared to a standard lease? Here's the income comparison. Here's how the income stacks up. A standard long-term lease on the same unit might generate $2,000 a month. Airbnb at a realistic year-round average, not peak season, is around $3,200. Corporate mid-term housing lands at $2,700 to $3,100, depending on your market and client type. That's within 15% of Airbnb income, with about 5 hours of monthly management work instead of 22. The income is close, the workload is not. Model B is the one I chose for the majority of my portfolio, and the numbers are why. Near Airbnb income with a fraction of the management hours and none of the regulation risk. But I want to be honest about the startup requirements, because this is where people underestimate the model. You need the unit to be fully furnished and move-in ready to a professional standard. Not Airbnb stylized, but clean, functional, and complete. You need to know how to reach corporate housing platforms and insurance relocation networks directly, because this model doesn't live on Airbnb or VRBO. That learning curve is real. If you want near zero management and you have significant capital to deploy, there's a third model that goes even further. And most residential investors have never looked at it. Model 3 is the one that completely changed how I think about real estate, even though I only deployed a portion of my capital here. It's the commercial triple net lease. And the structure is almost the opposite of everything residential investors are used to. In a standard residential rental, you own the property and pay the taxes, the insurance, and all the maintenance. In a triple net commercial lease, the tenant pays all three of those: the property taxes, the building insurance, and all ongoing maintenance costs are covered by the business renting from you. Think of a medical clinic, a regional distribution center, or a national chain restaurant. These tenants sign leases for 10, 15, or even 20 years, and they're backed by corporate credit, not individual income. You literally collect a check every month and do nothing else. Here's what the income looks like compared to the other two models. The income on a triple net commercial property is comparable to a long-term residential rental on a per-unit basis, but the lease length is 10 to 20 years instead of 12 months. The tenant handles all maintenance and costs, and your monthly management time is effectively zero. The trade-off is the entry barrier, which is significant and worth understanding before you pursue this model. The honest catch with Model C is the entry price. To buy a quality commercial triple net property outright requires significant capital. We're talking millions, not hundreds of thousands, but there's a workaround that most investors don't know exists. You can access this model through private commercial syndications or fractional ownership funds, where you pool capital with other investors and buy into larger assets together. I looked seriously at one syndication myself, a minimum buy-in of $25,000 for a fractional share of a distribution center lease. The numbers worked, but I wasn't ready to lock up that much capital for 15 years, while I was still figuring out my primary model. You get the passive income and zero management benefits without needing to buy the property outright. Now, let me show you how all three models compare directly side by side, because this is where the real decision becomes clear. When I sat down to make this decision with my own portfolio, I was asking three questions. First, how close can I get to my Airbnb income without taking on a second job? Second, what's the realistic startup work to make the switch? Third, what happens if my market shifts? Is there a backup plan built into the model? Model A answered question 3 perfectly. Almost no market shift is going to threaten a standard residential lease, but it failed question 1. The income drop was too significant. Model C answered question 1 partially and question 3 completely. But the entry barrier made full deployment impractical with the capital I had. Model B hit the sweet spot across all three questions for my specific situation, but your situation might score these differently. And that's exactly why you need to see the full comparison chart before making any decision. Here it is. This is the scorecard I used. Income relative to Airbnb, monthly management hours, startup complexity, regulatory risk, lease stability, and scalability. No single model wins every category. The right answer depends entirely on what you're optimizing for, and the matrix makes that decision obvious once you see the full picture. So here's the complete picture. Model 1, standard long-term rentals. Income drops roughly 50% compared to Airbnb gross. But the net gap is smaller than it looks once you strip out Airbnb's operating costs. Management time drops from 22 hours a month to about 2. Regulatory risk is essentially 0. Best for investors whose priority is simplicity over income maximization. Model 2, mid-term corporate housing. Income lands within 15% of a realistic Airbnb average, with about 5 hours of monthly management. No regulation risk. Startup requires learning a new marketing channel and maintaining professional furnishing standards. Best for investors who want near Airbnb income without the Airbnb lifestyle. Model 3. Commercial triple net leases. 0 management hours once the lease is signed. 10 to 20-year contracts with corporate tenants. Income is comparable to long-term residential, but completely hands-off. Entry requires significant capital or access to syndications. Best for investors at a later stage who want to completely step away from operations. I chose Model 2 as my primary pivot. But before I could execute that properly, I needed a system to analyze any deal in under 20 minutes. So I never made an expensive mistake again. That system is the next video. If this was useful, hit subscribe. Real numbers, real decisions, every week. Before I deployed a single dollar into corporate housing, I built a 5-step deal analysis system that I now run on every property I look at. Takes about 20 minutes and it saved me from at least 2 deals that looked great on the surface and would have lost money. That exact framework is in the next video in the playlist. It's already there. Click it.